Right, we've got the strain. Sorry about that. Right. Welcome to Windows on the World. And last week we had an interesting show, to say the least. And as a follow-up this week, we're going to be talking about the bigger picture of what we've been talking about for a long time. And that includes all the stuff about regeneration, the way that society's being re-engineered, etc. But first of all, we're going to kick off with some news items which I've managed to glean over the last week. And if you remember the name of our show last week, it was all about citizen spy program backfires. It was about Waltham Forest taking a picture through their third-party agents, NSL, who we'll be talking about, of a lady in the street who was alleged to have dropped a cigarette end. The next thing, she's a most wanted criminal in Waltham Forest. However, we phoned up the useful idiot who was responsible for putting her picture into the public domain on their Grimebusters website and also on their Twitter feed. And after the phone call and after contacting the CEO of Waltham Forest, the actual photograph was removed along with the website and the Twitter feed as well, which went with it. So we haven't heard anything else back from them. I've been sending this to Waltham Forest Council, who were the culprits of this last week. And of course, this was all done by NSL civil enforcement officers. Now, civil enforcement officers, as we know, took over from what were known as traffic wardens, and civil enforcement officers do have authority to actually kick your door in if the court appoints them. And this is the interesting bit, because obviously there has to be a court involved if there's a fine. Now, this is where they fell down, because they were making an allegation against somebody who's alleged to have done something. You can't do that, so that's where they got into trouble. But one of our listeners, Steve, has sent in some amazing information about NSL. Now, I looked at NSL. They took over from National Car Parks years ago, issuing parking tickets, and they're actually into so many different areas. And we talked about this separation of powers. In other words, the council, for instance, issuing their own summonses. Well, you can't have the prosecuting body and the issuing body, the claimant basically, and the prosecution in the same actual organisation, according to Halsby's Laws of England, but they do it anyway. This is very similar, but it goes into what we've been talking about for weeks about this stuff. We looked at Crime Stoppers, how they were partnered with ESRI, which is a data mapping company. Now, if it looks like NSL are into everything, so when we look at what they are into, it's quite surprising, because they're not just about issuing parking tickets. Their reach goes very deep. And this is some of the information that Stephen sent. And I had a run-in with NSL years ago. I was trying to make their managing director liable for the parking tickets that they'd issued. And they were also issuing fines for parking on private land as well. And I had issues with this, and we had an idea that we were going to go and clamp the CEO's car and see if he'd pay our fine, because we were so fed up with him. But things have escalated since then, and NSL employees have been found to be issuing parking tickets up to 10 a day. You've got to have your 10 a day, you see. And if you don't get them, you probably get kicked out and they have to find somebody else to take your job. This incentive scheme was unfurled quite a few years ago. So it can't be that different for the litter police. And I know people who've had terrible problems with this litter police, because they will actually follow you around till you drop a cigarette end, or they'll just accuse you of something you haven't done. And we covered that as well. A lady got accosted in Newham by the dog poo police a few years ago. We featured it on the show. I think we talked about this last week. And it wasn't even her dog, but that didn't deter them. And they even called the police when she tried to walk off with her dog. But apart from on-street parking and civil enforcement, remember that, they have their own in-house debt collectors. Yes, that's NSL. So they can issue the fine and then they can collect it. So according to Halsby's Laws of England, they shouldn't be able to do that, especially when there's no court involved, because in these cases there isn't. They may or may not use Northampton County Court Bulk Centre, but the way things are going, they don't really need to do that anymore, because these private bailiff companies or debt collection companies do it all in-house, and all this you need is an in-house lawyer. So they hire somebody who in the organisation who's a lawyer to write out some of the basically their fake legal documentation. It may be legal, but is it lawful? I don't think it actually is when you look into how this is meant to be set up. But they're into identity validation, so they're into data mining, foreign citizen work visas, council estate management, taking unsafe cars off the road, bus services and patient transport. So they're able to issue fines and then enforce the collection without the need to go to court, and might be seizing cars that are deemed unsafe, but only if you don't pay their fines, or have been caught fare dodging on one of their buses. Or will they come and pick you up as a patient and transfer you to a secure unit? I wouldn't put anything past them. That's what Stephen wrote to me last week, and he sent me a load of links, which is great for updates. He said they even admit that they have access to ANPR systems. Now, this may have been how they got me with ANPR. He was talking about a ticket that was issued to him, Yellow Box Junction. He said the images were very poor. Now, this is an interesting point, actually, because some of the photographs are very dubious that they supply. So it said NSL were the collection and enforcement agent of car tax for the DVLA. So it's plausible ANPR access would have been required, but they lost that contract to Capita in 2011. So that's interesting, because Capita is another organisation that does all of these different things, which revolves around controlling everything and issuing their own bailiff notice, because Capita and Equita do the same thing. They actually will collect on behalf of third parties. Now, Equita are another lot who aren't really bailiffs, they're more debt collectors, but they do actually send civil enforcement officers around. And of course, the civil enforcement officers aren't bailiffs, even though they can be appointed by a court. And I think that's where the grey area is here. In other words, they can be appointed by a court, but generally they're not. So they also seem to be selling personal data via the NSL Valid 8, that's the number 8, Valid 8 offshoot for around £2 a person. So this ties in with the wholesale abuse of data by Equifax, which Stephen sent me some information on several weeks ago, which ties into everything we've been saying. Capita, which we've already mentioned, and it looks like the government's quite happy for this digital marketplace section of the government to expand. Now, Validate enables users to authenticate documents, verify identity, and decide on individuals' right to enter, remain, work, rent, or access services. Now, this really is the brave new world, with a bit of 1984 thrown in. Users can compare an identity document automatically with a reference database of over 3,000 passport, ID card, driving license, and visa types, and establish validity in seconds. So this is absolutely what we've been talking about for a long time. Let's have a look what NSL actually says about itself, because it is all quite amusing. We design and operate parking controls. Oh, in the Royal Borough of Kensington, Chelsea, many other boroughs as well. One of the key goals of the service, see, they're offering a service, is to provide a safe environment for vulnerable people. How does issuing parking tickets and surveilling the public provide a safe environment for vulnerable people? Because it didn't the other week. We had to get that lady taken off the most wanted in Waltham Forest because she was photographed allegedly being discarding a cigarette butt. So how can this really be a service to the environment for vulnerable people? They're going to argue back that, well, we keep the streets clean and we deal with illegally parked vehicles. That's part of the story, really, though, isn't it? Each year we sponsor the Road Safety Programme, which provides road safety advice to primary schools, culminating in a poster campaign. for which we provide the book token prize. They give away book tokens. I mean, these people are making millions and they give away book tokens. Well, that's very good of them. A record number of children won prizes at the Royal Borough of Kensington, Chelsea. This was years ago, actually. This is still on their website. Our strategic goals include how we sustainably grow our core UK business, develop and share new ideas, support and grow our people, and keep customers at the heart of what we do. Working in communities across the UK, we value the communities we work in and support local initiatives. Our strategic vision is to be the leading UK service provider, delivering outstanding customer experiences in the regulated environments of health, central and local government. Health? That's interesting. Our strategic goals are growth of the core business in the UK, diversify the range of services we provide. They're certainly doing that. Position the business for continued sustainable growth. We've got diversity and sustainable here in the first few lines. They're ticking the boxes. Develop and share new ideas to do things better. Support and grow our people and teams. Strengthen LSL's position as a valued and trusted brand. That's great, isn't it? We are committed to sustainable, again, and ethical business operations, checking that materials and labour are sourced ethically and making sure our teams get the best deal in the extremely competitive marketplace. Yeah, okay. So this is interesting. Now, this ties in with exactly what they're saying about sustainable growth. The number of parking tickets handed to drivers has risen by almost 1 million in 12 months, according to a motoring research charity. The figures suggest a penalty notice is issued every 6 seconds in the UK. The RAC Foundation analysis of government data shows 5.65 million vehicle keeper records were obtained from the Driver and Vehicle Licensing Agency by parking management firms in the last financial year. Now, we talked about how that was being abused last week in last week's show. Citizen Spy Program backfires. We talked quite a lot about that. But that's incredible, isn't it? That's a 20% increase on the total of 4.71 million during 2016 and 17. Now, a decade ago, in 2007-2008, fewer than 500,000 records were released. Parking companies used the information to chase vehicle owners for alleged infringement in private car parks, sending penalty charges up to £100. Well, we know how to deal with those. You use the BOVAT remedy, boevat.org.uk. We've done a show on that, and it does work. But don't just use templates. Use your own and understand what you're doing, because it's all about understanding and being able to comprehend what you are doing in law with this stuff. That's where you get them. That's why last week's show was a success, because we actually put those people on the spot. Now, I had a pretty good idea that what they were doing wasn't actually lawful, but they could have argued a point with me, but they chose not to. They chose just to take it down, took that lady's picture down, which is quite an interesting development. And I've had quite a few of these victories. Really, they're small victories, but ultimately they'll save you a lot of time and money, and also be able to curtail what is actually going on. So this is quite an incredible thing, really, that these parking people are making so much money out of every level of it, like from the dog poo police, the litter enforcement, to surveillance. They're partnered with local authorities. This is NSL for CCTV. And I mean, this is just really what's called corruption. It's actually just corruption. And the local authorities are all in with each other. I mean, there's 100 councillors now being identified as having links to property companies. And this has been a revolving door for a long time. We have that Claire Kober, who basically did all the deal with Lend-Lease in Haringey. And of course, now she's openly saying she's going to work for Pinnacle. And last week on Twitter, she put up, oh, it's really hard work being a councillor, and sometimes a thankless task. Well, it is if you're her, I would think, and I would hope. But then she put up this tweet, and it was from a child saying, thank you so much for all the help you gave me. And it's the most sickening thing I've seen since I saw the cabinet member of the environment, who we won't mention his name this week, being basically abused by people when he'd closed all the roads down. but actually they were arguing with him. So what he did was he turned to an 8-year-old child and started talking to the child and made it look as though the adults were interrupting, you know. I mean, this is the lowest of the low, and these people are public servants. They're there to serve us. But we know really what this is about. It's actually about total control of everything through the Stasi. And this is a massive, massive thing. And we cover it all the time. And this week we're going to talk about architecture, the architects of design. In other words, all the stuff that we've gone into over the last few weeks and months about Agenda 21, these habitat conferences that they have every 2 years, which actually dictate how you are living in a city. These people, these remote authorities, which aren't authorities, they're basically academics that get invited to these things. And then, of course, it becomes part of planning. All the planners get involved. Then, of course, all the architects get involved because they have to. We went to a planning meeting in Croydon and we met the architects who were putting up this tower block. And apparently they were in such a rush to get it up that the place is infested with rats. They never cleared the rats away. So people have got rats burrowing out of their walls. I mean, this is all about the new style of building, and it's all about throwing it up basically very, very quickly. Before we get our guest on tonight, Chris, who's going to talk about architecture and the bigger picture of all this and the history of it and where we are now, I was sent this today as a reminder from Sonia, who sends me great articles every week. And the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, are actually making everybody's bank account details available to interested third parties. It says the bank account details of everyone are going to be available for registered organisations. Registered organisations. Well, that means anyone like Capita or Equita, anybody who you might owe money to, actually. So in other words, they might not be writing to you in future. They might be just going to your bank and taking it out at source. What you have to do by the 25th of May is write into your bank and say you do not agree to this because it's done by tacit agreement. In other words, if you don't object, then everything's hunky-dory. So if you don't object, then they will do it. So you have to write to your bank. So yeah, parking ticket bandits and councils will get access by tacit agreement. So that's pretty scary, isn't it? I thought there was going to be a time when this would happen, but I didn't think it'd be this year. I mean, councils have been going into people's bank accounts for quite some time, and they do actually have to get an order to do that, same as the Child Support Agency were doing. They were getting attachments of earnings for things like council tax and so-called child support, which isn't child support. It's about a looting operation, which we've covered many years ago. And the repercussions of that are still going on because they're still trying it on with these historic debts that don't exist to seize people's houses. So if these people have access to your bank account, what could possibly go wrong? We'll have a think about that for a minute. But we've got some interesting articles that I just wanted to go through. And I've just got this going on here with the stuff about the councillors. Yes. And it is quite incredible that we've got all of these councillors that are blatantly just going to work for property developers. So you've seen what's happening. This is a big part of what we're talking about. In your area, all this sustainable development, all this hive housing that's being put up is being done and rushed through with the help of these councillors who are in the hands of property developers. It's actually incredible, really, because when you think about it, this is beyond conflict of interest. This is just absolute self-interest. And it's being done blatantly in your face. And what I'm going to suggest tonight is that local councils are actually the enemy of the people now. Previously, they had a fiduciary duty to you because they owned you through the poor laws, and you were a pauper, a ward of the court, a ward of the council, etc. We've gone into all that. It's very interesting. Have a look at our stuff on birth certificates and are you a pauper? There is actually a whole exposition of the poor laws and why you were property of the state and property of the parish, more importantly, and how that turned into the birth certificate from what was called the certificate of settlement, which made you basically a bonded slave or pauper. And if you think about it, really, we are in a new age of slavery because we've got this huge voluntary sector that's being imposed on people. And it's all done through this Agenda 2030, which is sustainable development. And I've seen boroughs absolutely overtaken by this. And these change agents are coming in, being trained as social entrepreneurs. And these are the architects of change. But we also have the architects of housing. And first of all, I just wanted to have a look at a few things. Yes, this was a good one. This was a good one. Now, when we get in these local newspapers, surveys, and opinion pieces, more often than not, they're completely fake. And I've proved this time and time again, if you listen to our shows. And so we've got this project in Waltham Forest called Mini Holland. And it says, new study supports Mini Holland as safer for cyclists. Well, no study that I know of actually supports it because there hasn't been a study, but public opinion is against it, apart from cycling lobby groups who've been co-opted into it. So what you've got is a picture of a road, then a cycle track, which is basically the same size as the road. And the University of Westminster study found there's a safety in numbers for cyclists. Well, look, if you just put cyclists all in one lane or one road, which is 2 lanes, then you probably are going to have less accidents. Most accidents with cyclists tend to be on junctions when cyclists are trying to turn left across traffic. And these are the most serious accidents that get reported. And generally, now I don't want to generalize here, I don't want loads of cyclists attacking me, but it's often the cyclist's fault because these people who are driving the lorries, these guys, they're really high up and they can't see you. And it clearly says that on the back of their lorry as well. If you can't see, if you can't see my mirrors, I can't see you. It says that on the side of the lorries, doesn't it? And it says do not undertake. On a lot of lorries, it says do not undertake because they can't see you. So if you've got something that's 5 to 15 tons coming at you, it's wise actually to get out of the way. And also, a lot of the East European drivers aren't as careful. I've noticed that from being in a car. I mean, they will just cut in. They are quite dangerous, or maybe they're just tired because, as we know, there's a shortage of lorry drivers. And it's no wonder, is it? Because we've got these incentives to get rid of all transport and all basically ill thought out ideas because everything comes in by road. So University of Westminster research paper, it says here, has revealed that streets where there are more cyclists are 13% have less crashes than those with fewer riders. Hang on a minute. Research papers reveal that streets where there are more cyclists are 13% to have less crashes. This doesn't even make sense. This is so badly written. It doesn't even actually make sense than those with fewer riders. Waltham Forest and Enfield both won. Oh, they won! They won Mini Holland funding from Transport for London 3 years ago. We've won it! We've won it! We're going to close the roads down. We won! Yes! But the schemes, each costing around 30 million, have been controversial because they have caused road closures and one-way systems. Well, what they've done is they've caused chaos on the 2 main roads that surround these areas. That's what they've done. And also another thing, article that Sonia sent me as a digression, was that less and less people are using buses in that area now because the buses are stuck in traffic all day. So people aren't using buses, and this means that bus routes are going to get cancelled. So all this stuff about public transport is absolutely untrue. This is unplanned. It's all about corporate greed at the end of the day. So all this sustainable development plans, all this remote authority that's been planning this stuff have got no idea how it works. However, the people above the useful idiots know how it works, and their plan is to get rid of all private transport. And that is clearly stated in the Sustainable Development Goals, actually. You don't even have to really read between the lines. Look at what's being imposed. Everything is against cars and vehicles, especially with the new ultra-low emission zone and saying that we're going to have all electric cars within a few years. So this is quite incredible. So just to be clear, the data we used were from 2013 to 2014. So there isn't anything that directly relates to recent infrastructure investment in Waltham Forest. However, we did exactly. So in other words, it's got nothing to do with it. So what they've done, they've tagged on some old research and tagged it onto their project. Oh yeah, well this says that it's better when there's more cyclists. However, we did find that lower levels of motor traffic are associated with lower risk for people cycling. Well, of course, that's absolutely blatantly obvious. Hence, this tends to support the kinds of intervention that Waltham Forest have been making in those streets. So what we've got here is we've got a new study, and it's not a new study, right, that says supports Mini Holland when it doesn't, and they've printed it. So this is the East London and West Essex Guardian. I mean, how can these people have a job? This is by someone called Alice Richardson, local democracy reporter. Well, I would say that this is just a propaganda piece that you haven't even edited or even thought about. So the new study is not a new study, and it doesn't support Mini Holland. This is incredible, absolutely incredible. The study also found that residential or 20-mile-per-hour streets have lower injury odds than other street types. Now, actually, that isn't true. If you took that as a template for everywhere, that would not be true. Because what they're talking about here is urbanized areas in certain places, just certain parts of these schemes that they're talking about. Collisions involving cyclists typically occur at roundabouts. Well, actually, no, that's not true. I've just said at junctions, more at junctions than roundabouts, I would say, and on A roads. Okay. Research found that up to 2/3 of all cyclists injured or hurt on A roads in London. Well, they would be, wouldn't they, I suppose? In 2016, 8 people were killed whilst out cycling in London, whilst 446 were seriously injured. Dr. Aldred's study found cyclists are hugely overrepresented in collision statistics. What do you mean overrepresented? Well, how can overrepresented against what? Against pedestrians? Against other vehicles? Is that what he's saying? I think so. And the risks of cycling in London is substantially higher than it is in the Netherlands. I wonder why that is. Because Mini Holland in Holland is different from Mini Holland in the middle of an urban area. What a ridiculous thing to say. I mean, so there you go. That's a bit of fake news for you from the East London and West Essex Guardian. So the new study doesn't support Mini Holland, and the actual study is not about it anyway in the first place. It was old news. So that's a bit of yes, Stasi propaganda, I would say. So we've got the mayor's now extending the ultra low emissions zone. He's proud of this. The puppet Sadiq Khan plans to extend the ultra low emissions zone will improve London's toxic air, it has been claimed. Now, this is an interesting one because in actual fact, since I moved to London in the 80s, the actual level of pollution has drastically reduced, and it's drastically reduced, I think, from the 70s and also even the 90s, because I think there are less cars on the road than there were in the 90s. And at this point, I've been going on about this for a while, so I'm going to bring in Chris. Chris, all this stuff about congestion and low emission zones, I want to ask you something before we get into the bigger story tonight. When you come into London, do you think there's more or less pollution than there was previously?
Less. There's less pollution, but there seems to be more. Last time I went to London, I went to King's Cross, to a meeting down there, and there seems to be a more stressful environment. There's police sirens going off. It's like hell let loose. Now, I used to walk from King's Cross to near Great Portland Street every morning, and this was in the 80s, and it was never like that. And I came back really stressed out of my mind. But yes, there was less pollution because I used to wear a white shirt, and it was always jet black, literally, when I came home from the filth in London. I came home, I had a T-shirt on, a white T-shirt, and it was relatively clean. So, yes, it has got a lot cleaner, but I think what's happened is where there never used to be bus lanes and things like that, they've squashed the areas where cars can go and made it so complicated that I think you're correct. There is less cars on the road. There definitely, without a doubt, shadow of doubt. I mean, I remember the time when, in the 80s, I was working on a project, Billingsgate, and I would drive down there if I worked at a weekend. And it was quite a straightforward drive from Hertfordshire. I wouldn't, I wouldn't dream of doing it now with this, congestion charge and things like that. But do you know? Did I ever tell you about with a congestion charge? What a policeman told me who lived near me. He noticed he was guarding an area, and he noticed that before the congestion charge came in, some fellas tinkering with the traffic lights. And one of his colleagues went over to him and said, "You know what they're doing?" He said, "Well, we're making the lights stay at red longer in order to create a sort of a traffic jam." And I said, "Hey, what's going on?" And then when just before the congestion charge came in, they altered the traffic lights back. So what happened is people were saying, "Oh, it's terrible, the traffic." They created a problem. Then when the congestion charge came in to justify it, they'd altered the traffic lights to make it look as if the charge was making traffic flow more freely and things like that. It was a con.
I can vouch for that, Chris, because that was exactly what taxi drivers were telling me at the time. They were telling me that. They were saying they've rephased the lights, and after the congestion charge, they just changed the phasing of the lights, and everything was flowing brilliantly. Yeah, absolutely true. But I've got a great one before we get into the meat and potatoes tonight, Chris. I have to read this out. This again is from this East London and West Essex Guardian, which just seems to be one of the, well, it's the Guardian of fake news. There is no question about it. Now, this was from the 3rd of May. And get this one. You're going to love this, Chris. Pollution is a major cause of rising crime levels. Okay, a new study claims that air pollution is a major cause of the rising levels of crime, including shoplifting and pickpocketing in the capital. Barnet air pollution. They can't even write these people. It says Barnet air pollution are 9% higher than the London average, the highest in the capital. In the borough, the share of days with an AQI above 35 is 33%. Whilst the London average is 24%. The shared days, forget all that bit. Yeah, okay. A study published last week by London School of Economics. Oh, here we go. LSE. LSE and UCL are the harbingers of fake news and propaganda, and totally Agenda 21 globalist, if you like that word, if you don't use another one, mind control. Absolutely dreadful places. The London School of Economics is totally pushing the fake climate change agenda and Agenda 2030. The LSE suggests that air pollution causes an increase in crime, particularly less severe crime, such as shoplifting and pickpocketing. Now, this is something beyond that I even thought was possible that anyone could even write this. The researchers, we've got researchers, have we? And you name any of them, found that a 10-point rise in the air pollution measure, the air quality index, increases the crime rate by 0.9%. How can you measure that? That's ridiculous. Dr. Seffi Roth, assistant professor of environmental economics, someone who's clearly not got enough to do, and co-author of the paper, said, our research suggests, it suggests again, so it's not true. It's just, well, we'll suggest it. Our research suggests that reducing air pollution in urban areas could be a cost-effective way to reduce crime, in addition to the health benefits it would bring. We did not find that London's ongoing spate of knife crime would be affected by improved air quality. Well, so they're saying that basically there'd be less shoplifting if there was less air pollution. However, if the number of less serious crimes could be reduced, so it's this is a non-event, right? This is a non-article. It's not saying anything. It's absolutely saying nothing. It states nothing as fact, and it's not even conjecture. The police could potentially be freed up to allocate more resources to these types of very serious incidents. Well, the police, by their own admission, don't attend small crime incidents, which is burglaries and shoplifting and people getting robbed in the street. They don't even report them anymore. So, well, I mean, do these people ever go out? Clearly not. If he thinks that there's too much air pollution and it's increasing the crime level. If we get rid of air pollution, then the crime level's going to go down. I mean, this is just utterly absurd. I mean, I thought Sky News was bad, but I don't think even they'd put this out. Commenting on the upcoming local elections on the Mayor of London. Oh, yeah, Sadiq Khan. This was from a while ago then. Let's see when it was, actually. It was from 3rd of May. Maybe it's last year. It just says 3rd of May. Okay, right. It doesn't really matter anyway. But it's incredible. He says, only Labour is taking the action needed to tackle air pollution in our city, while the Tories have repeatedly opposed measures to crack down on our unhealthy pollution levels. Barnet air pollution levels are 9% higher than the London average, says a new study. Well, that's probably because everyone drives there, and they've got road humps and 20 miles per hour and Agenda 21 nightmare all over the place. And it's basically a complete police state surveillance grid like other areas of London. It's just incredible. These useful idiots churning out this nonsense. But more importantly, these stupid local newspapers printing them are not even able to put things in that are grammatically correct. Do you have this up your way, Chris? Do you have a problem with grammar? Maybe that's caused by pollution,
Well, yes. I mean, I sincerely hope that the people... I mean, it's nice to see that people that write for this local paper, they're helping the mentally deranged, get something to do, occupy their times. But I just hope that Matron keeps them heavily medicated if they have to go out into the community. That's all. But yes, we have a lot of drivel, especially from the propaganda magazine that comes through not only from the local council but the county council, where we're told that but they have to start a property company. This is the county council, Hertford County Council, because we're living longer and we need more homes because we're living longer. Really? Are we? So that means, are we living to 120, 130 maybe? No, we're not living any longer than any other time in modern history, really. I don't see that. In fact, if anything, and I've got no statistics to go on, I don't think we're living as long, because I'm noticing now fewer people seem to be hitting the century, the 100. I'm noticing a lot of younger people that are heavily medicated. So I think that's a load of old bills. I've been saying that for ages. And when you consider that and this is the Office of National Statistics, there is 1 million empty homes in this country, and that is you can check that out for yourself, the Office of National Statistics. Plus, according to the Mirror newspaper, there is enough houses for every homeless family to have a choice of 6 houses.
Yes, I know we talked about that last week, but that's in a way what was talked about in 1969 by Dr. Richard Day. He actually said in this lecture, which was basically off the cuff, and it was meant to be off the record. People were told not to record it. He actually worked for what became the Planned Parenthood at the time, which is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Of course, Gates is really into the eugenics thing. And he was saying all this years ago in 1969. He was saying that all these things would happen, including what you've just said. And everything that we talk about was predicted. And the one thing that he didn't actually predict was it would be the UN, because the UN at the time was not getting any traction. It hasn't really got any traction, but what it's got is an assumption. And it's been funded by billionaires to the point where the funding has gone into climate change. So these billionaires like Maurice Strong, total criminals, went in, and they just started spouting this stuff on behalf of the UN. The UN basically listened to them, and they dictated policy, which was to enslave everybody through sustainable development. And when you look at these organizations, the UN is a completely lawless body. It's above international law. You look it up for yourself. It's in their charter. We've got it on our website that they cannot be prosecuted. They're above international law. Everything they've got is inviolable. Nothing can be touched. They're their own separate state wherever they are in the world. They don't follow the jurisdiction of the country they're in. And what else do you need to know? Just look up the UN. But the local councils are all under the UN, basically. They're under this... it's basically just a corporate takeover of everything, and we talk about it all the time, but the corporate side of it is so blatant now. And when you see these councillors with their noses in the trough like this, it's absolutely incredible. And yeah, you just think how much further can it actually go? Because I've never known anything like it. I mean, you used to get the odd one that was corrupt, didn't you? And they'd resign. But now they just say, "Yeah, I'm corrupt, and I've ruined the borough, and now I'm going to work for a property developer. I'm going to get loads of money for it. Yeah, and then it's announced by the property developer that they're going to do it. So it's pretty incredible. But another thing that's happening is that civilians are being hired as detectives now. Chris, did you know this? So not only have we got the litter police, we've got people being hired by the Metropolitan Police, the Essex Police, and Kent Police. The call's gone out for those looking for a career change and with suitable skill sets. Trainees will need to be able to compassionately support family members of murder victims, have the mindset to investigate serious and complex crimes. Well, wait a minute. How many of the police can actually investigate serious and complex crimes anymore? They can't investigate any crimes and be able to put a case together before a judge. Well, anyone can put a case together before a judge. But it says usually the pathway to becoming a detective is only open to existing officers serving with the police who work to gain their professional accreditation. But now the force is opening up the role in the hope of attracting people from all walks of life. Chief Constable Stephen Kavanagh, who spent a number of years working as a detective on a homicide team in the Metropolitan Police, said, "As a former detective, I know how invaluable the additional skills these officers can bring are to keep you safe, investigate thoroughly, and put our most serious villains behind bars." Well, he's talking about these people coming in. Being a detective means you will deal with those criminals causing the most harm in our communities. It's a challenging role with long hours, sometimes complex cases, and sometimes lengthy, heartbreaking investigations where victims have been subject to the most awful crimes. Yes, crime farming. So this is quite disturbing to me, having reported what we have done on crime farming, which is basically the burying of all defence evidence and the creation of criminals. However, before we move on, have you got anything to say about that, Chris?
I mean, I've seen a couple of series of Columbo, so I might be okay as a detective. And I saw Agatha Christie as well, so I might be suitably qualified. But what gets me is they're talking about crime, but what creates crime? I mean, when you look at the environment, I mean, there are criminals, yes, in Hampstead, but they're high-level criminals in their multi-million-pound homes in posh parts of London. But when you look at the most deprived areas, you notice there's an old saying, you go into the leafy suburbs. Now, that sounds rather nice. There was a program called Metroland years ago, where the Metropolitan Railway, as it stretched out, they built modern housing estates. And this was in the 1920s and 30s. But I believe we're creating criminality because when you look at it, we live in a society that is completely pessimistic all the time. We no longer have careers. I mean, when I was at school, we had careers advice. No, it's jobs. That's demoralizing. A job, that's like a slave. And what's happening in Sheffield, they're chopping all the trees down, and they found, I don't really want to harp on statistics, but they found that whenever you cut trees down, the crime rate goes up, because after all, we are animals, and for thousands of years we lived in forests. And there's something very scientists have gone into this. Shades of green calm people down. Greenery calms people down. And a stressful environment creates more of a crime mentality. Because let's face it, you live like sardines packed in with each other. They've found that with rats, they start attacking each other and get niggly with each other. Whereas you give people a little bit of space, you have greenery around them and create a better environment. Admittedly, not all will be perfect, nice model citizens, but the majority will be. And I think we are creating crime for the future.
This is really interesting, and it takes us into what we're going to talk about, actually, about architecture and design and all of this urban planning that's going on. Because what they're doing, they're trying to create this brave new world society, but it's actually going to make it worse because they're cramming all of these people into these areas. And that's why I moved out of the area I was in when they were going to build 1,000 flats on my doorstep. I knew what it was going to be like. And what's not been factored into this is the actual bigger picture, because behind all this, the idea is actually to farm more crime, to get more crime going, because what you want to do is create an environment of fear. So basically you've got this brave new world mentality coming in, that everything's looking great and it's like a little toy town, but it's actually really dangerous. And so they're going to get people to beg for even further enslavement. It's very simple, and you can see that's exactly the purpose of it. But let's look at the sort of architecture. When we look at the building of the past, like if we look at buildings from the 18th and 19th century, or even go further back than that, well, they're really, really interesting, well-built, architecturally pleasing, aesthetically sound-looking, and if you go into, say, the centre of London, say go to Piccadilly, those buildings have a sort of authority about them, and you know where you are. But the idea of all this sustainable development stuff is to create these places where you don't know where you are. And this has happened all over London. I've got out of tube stations and they've got all these new developments being built, and it's not a superficial thing. They've actually changed the whole environment. Say that area around Tottenham Court Road, that looks like Croydon now. So there's a uniformity of culture that's been put in. And so the introduction of the high rise was probably responsible for a lot of this in the 60s, and the brutal architecture. Now, if you look at something like the Barbican, the flats at the Barbican, they're as hideous now as they were then. I mean, I know people who live in there, and it's a horrible building. It's dark, it's very foreboding, it's pretty creepy, it's ugly, and it doesn't look any good at all. So what we're getting now is even higher density than that. So as building costs have gone down, the quality's gone down as well. And the new high density housing is actually the worst I've ever seen. So I think this is a good time for you to come in now, Chris, at last, because your background is architecture. Now, I've just given a bit of a rambling introduction there, but we now see the results of what's happening in this pack and stack housing. And where do you think it started to go wrong? I'd be interested to find out.
Well, if you talk to most architects that have been through what I think is a corrupted education system, they will get down on their knees and almost worship Le Corbusier. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard of Le Corbusier, or probably pronounce his name wrong, but he was an architect in the 1950s and 60s, and he was the first, well, shall we say, there may have been other people before him, but he's the most recognised that started high-rise buildings, and he believed that we should have cities in the sky, and he built in the south of France these high-rise buildings, and where you had shops in them, but they worked for several reasons. One is the people that moved into them were quite well off. Two, they had a system where they were managed, these flats. When you walked into the flat, there was a chap with a uniform who said good morning, and they knew who lived there, etc., etc. And then he was commissioned to do a new city. Now, I'm not sure if it was Brazil or Mexico. Your listeners will probably be able to, this is off the top of my head, so sorry about this. It's either Brazil or Mexico. But when I was at college, we saw this. And he built this new city. Again, the name escapes me, but I assure you this happened. And he realised that cars were the thing of the future. And this was in the late 1950s. So he decided not to have any pavements. And this particular city has more road deaths, pedestrian road deaths, than any other place in the world, because people are having to walk in the roads because there's no pavements at all. And his ideas, well, they would sort of work in a utopian society, and he lived in Cloud Cuckoo Land. And then after him, the architects learnt all about Le Corbusier, and we was going high rise. But the guilty finger is always pointed at the architects, but really the guilty finger should look at the clients, because the architects are more like cab drivers. They once they've finished a project, they've got to look for the next project, and they've got to look for the next client, and they've got to please the client. So really, they're, shall we say, I suppose, prostitutes in suits in many ways, because they're just pleasing the client, and their creativity, because of finance and that, is very, very shallow. You know, I mean, for example, most clients, if they could get away with people living in tents, they would. You know? But let's face it, let's look at a few things. Number one, if there's a real housing shortage, why aren't we building modern day versions of prefabs? That's a question I put, and nobody seems to answer it. You know, the 1940s, late 1940s, there was, I believe, there was a housing shortage. Not that much, but there was, because of World War II. So they mass-produced prefabs, and they're only built to last 10 years, but a lot of them are still up today. But one area I'd like to look at is, now, I might sound as if I'm going into the realms of fantasy now. Now, imagine if you had a TARDIS or a time machine, okay, and you could take 3 items with you into the past. So you would take, say, a house, modern house that's just been built, a car, and a modern computer, okay? And we go back, shall we say, 50 years to 1968. It's doubtful they will be able to reproduce a computer. They'd have a computer. I mean, in those days, a computer that gave out, I think it was about 5 megabytes of power, would take up a complete office block. They couldn't do it. If you asked them to reproduce a modern day car, they would probably copy it, but the electronics in it, there wouldn't be electronics, and it would be very mechanical and very basic. Ask them to produce an exact copy of a modern day house, no problems at all. The materials such as fiberglass, double glazing was around then, and there would be no real changes as such. All right, we have trusses instead of putting the old-fashioned rafters on roofs and things like that. And we've got plasterboard, and everybody thinks that plasterboard, oh, it's modern. No, it was invented in 1910. Now, let's go further back in time. Let's go back to 100 years. And you would show people, say, let's go to manufacturers, car manufacturers of those days, like Henry Ford and Vauxhalls and that, and say, can you reproduce this car? No way. They wouldn't have the technology to do it. They might be able to copy the shape, but the electronics in it, forget it. You know, you wouldn't have electric windows or anything like that. Because remember, 100 years ago, we had the Model T Fords around and things like that. Show them a computer, well, you can forget that. No way. Show them a house, they could reproduce it. Easy. All right, the double glazing might be a bit dodgy, the electrical wiring might be a bit iffy, but they could make an exact copy. And if you transported, say, a builder from 100 years ago to a modern building site, admittedly, some of the modern machinery that they use, such as power tools and that, would be a little bit of a head-scratching for that person initially, but they wouldn't find it strange. And they would probably be shocked at how shoddy the workmanship is now. Now, if you go back even further, go back to 150 years, well, you can forget about the car and you can forget about the computer, they could still reproduce a house. And, remember, they had cavity walls. Wow, what a marvellous breakthrough, just leaving a gap of 50 millimetres between the 2 leaves of walling. And, all right, the modern components of a house, double glazing, yes, more advanced. They've got insulation now, which is better. We've got roof trusses, which come along on the back of a lorry and are put up by a crane on top of a house. But what has really changed? And you could go back, say, 300 years. And you imagine if you brought a builder from 300 years ago and brought him now, he would look at a house under construction and he wouldn't really be that baffled. He'd find it a little strange, but say, oh yes, I recognise that. And you think it a bit odd that we got windows coming from site, where it was all built on site, and doors coming from site, but they wouldn't be very lost. I'd like to ask your listeners, and yourself, Mark and Tony, why has housing remained just a few steps above Stone Age? And I'll give a little clue. When I started college, the lecturer said, and I've never forgotten this, he said, gentlemen, remember there's two political parties in this country. There's the road builders and the house builders. If you're in road building, you vote for the road builders, and if you're in house building or construction, vote for the house builders. He said, because you'll notice just out of the limelight, in every major political party, there's a representative from the building industry. Their name won't be in the limelight, but they'll be there, and they will be pulling strings along with the bankers. Remember that, and you won't go far wrong. And that was in the 1970s, and he was spot on, absolutely spot on. We could produce housing, like I said. Now, we don't want to have housing looking, well, we've already got bland-looking estates all over the place. But, for instance, now, I haven't been to Australia, and this is second-hand. This is from an Australian architect that I got this from. So if your listeners know differently to this, but this is second-hand information. He said that I think it was in Queensland in Australia, when they do any housing, they're not allowed to have two houses exactly the same next to each other. They have what is called triple-fronted wood veneers, which is like those bungalows they have. And he said, also the services that go into the housing, you've got to have like cobbled stones to show where those services are, so you could dig them up and get to them easier. He said, everything is logical, but you'll never see several houses the same. You might be able to build the same house, say 6 houses along, but not next door to each other. Now, this was second-hand information. I haven't looked this up. If your listeners know differently, please tell me, but that's what I heard, and I heard that about 30 or 40 years ago. And I believe that we can have modern houses that come to the 21st century. They could be mass-produced, but you look at these hobbit home type structures. Now, all right, they're expensive to build, but if we built something that was within nature, wouldn't that be better to come out in the morning and see trees around? And you can actually increase the density of housing. And, for example, there was a method of house construction in the early 70s that they tried out in California, where you actually had you got this kind of mass-produced unit, a bit difficult to explain. Putting it bluntly, you dug a hole in the ground, you stuck this unit there, then you backfilled with earth, so that when you wanted to go into your garden, you'd walk onto your roof, and you'd have roof gardens. So when you looked at this housing estate, all you saw was green fields, but there was a high-density housing. And what they had, if you look up Oscar Newman's defensible space, Oscar Newman believed that we should all have defensible space. And what that means is, I mean, he tried it out. He went to a housing estate, and it was just an ordinary piece of communal grass in front where dogs relieve themselves on it. And he stood there and he said, I can guarantee that nobody's going to ask me what I'm doing here. So I'm on private ground, and people are coming and going inside these flats, not bothering. He then went to another area where there was just a 6-inch high little fence around the grass. He just stepped on the grass with the camera crew, and a person came out and said, excuse me, what are you doing here? It's defensible space. They felt that that belonged to them. We're very territorial. And the reason that they don't look at these things when they're building houses is because it costs money. And house building in this country, it's the bottom line is money, money, money. There's an artificial shortage, I believe. I don't think there is a shortage of houses. And I'm not talking about... I agree with that. Sorry?
I agree with that entirely. I think it's absolutely manufactured, the whole thing.
Yeah. But this is the thing. Why are houses so primitive? I mean, Tony, you were in the building industry. Plasterers were around 100 years ago, 150 years ago. I'm not against plastering, but look at the components of a house. It hasn't changed. Can you imagine if we drove cars that never progressed? I mean, we'd be nowadays, when you catch an aeroplane, you'd be hanging onto the wings of something that looked like something that the Wright brothers used. We'd be all driving around in Model T Fords. They've progressed. Aircraft have progressed. Things have got better. But housing is exact. They always say, oh, yes, well, every house is a one-off. Yes, but why does it have to be so labour intensive? Why is it so old-fashioned?
This is the thing as well. And when you look at these, I would call it dystopian underneath it all, but they're meant to be utopian visions of all these people like Jack Fresco with these futuristic cities, which are totally impractical, in my view, because you'd have to rip everything up and start again, I think. But
Jack Fresco, don't talk about him.
No, well, I wasn't going to, but he was used by these people to enforce Agenda 21. And I even get people who contact me who still think that the Venus Project and all this nonsense is a good idea, and they don't see through it for what it is. But what's interesting about this, Chris, the reason I mentioned it, is that nowhere in these plans and these utopian visions are there any provisions or instruction as to what the actual infrastructure and buildings are going to be like. That's the really weird thing. So you've got Habitat.org, which is this conference that takes place every 2 years, and it basically predicts what's going to happen in your town or city. But nowhere on their website does it say anything about building and practicalities and what places are going to look like and what they're going to have. You're allocated a certain amount of space, which, as you're saying, is too little. So it's going to make for more conflict and more crime. There's no doubt about that. That's already happening. So we can already see that that's happening. But they have things like spatial development, balanced territorial development, that accounts for different scales of cities and human settlements, strengthens their role in food security and nutrition systems, puts housing at the centre, builds infrastructure and services, facilitates trade and connects farmers and fishers across value chains and markets. Now, I don't even know what that really means apart from the Newspeak interpretation of that, which basically means being shoved into a very small space and having everything controlled around you, and a heavy reliance on public transport. That's all it seems to actually come down to. But it goes on that development, this is called social inclusion, and this is all meant to be, this is the plans for modern cities. Social inclusion, development must protect the planet and enable all inhabitants, whether living in formal or informal settlements, to lead decent, dignified and rewarding lives and to achieve their full human potential. Now, I don't want the UN telling me what my full potential is, because my idea of my full potential may not be theirs and probably isn't. And as Peter Cook once said, I have no intention of reaching my potential. It's absolutely ridiculous. So you've got, when you go on to development, balanced territorial development that accounts for different scales of cities and human settlements, strengthens their role in food security and nutrition system. Okay, now this is absolutely incredible stuff. I'm just looking through it, recapping that, but still don't really get it. Inclusive and sustainable economic growth. Now, this is what they say, but the plans that they put out are against all that, because they destroy small businesses, they destroy individuality, they bring in a consensus reality where everything is about poverty. It's actually about not having any money, because most of it is about voluntary work. They seem to think everyone's going to work for nothing in the future, and this was really part of the Brave New World thing. In other words, that has to be sorted out in advance, but it's not been sorted out in advance, because what they've done is they've created wage slaves. People are paying 500 grand for basically a shoebox, and like you're saying, it's in something that's been chucked up in 5 minutes. I mean, the standard of the building here, and it's not uniform. That's the weird thing. Even though we went to a planning meeting for architects who were putting up this block in Croydon, and they were perfectly ordinary people. The woman, the architect, she she was just saying, oh, yeah, that's sustainable development. Yeah, we have to do certain things. She said, and I don't really understand it all, because they don't understand it all. They're just architects. They're doing the job, but we have to plan these certain things in. But apart from that, there doesn't seem to be any planning or real foresight going into this. What it seems to be is a free-for-all for developers who just chuck something up. And that is, I suppose, what you would have expected to happen after the Second World War or something like that. Do you know what I mean? So it doesn't make sense, because they've now got the opportunity to really plan, and they've got this action plan that they want to implement, but it doesn't come down to anything practical apart from the control of population. Do you see where I'm going with this, Chris?
I see exactly.
Architecture at all.
Well, I agree. You see, what they used to have in the 1960s, they used to have the Parker Morris standards. And the Parker Morris standards, now people incorrectly used to think it was a law. It's not law, no. It's like the code of practice. There is a code of practice. And people incorrectly think that that's law. No, it's just a practice how you should work. For example, with the Parker Morris standards of the 1960s, if you go to a new town, like, say, Harlow or Stevenage, the ones I know, pardon me, you'll notice that when you go into the hall of these properties that are built in the 50s and early 60s, they have huge halls. And the reason why is women in those days had big prams for the children, because there was a baby boom. So they wanted somewhere to park their pram. And each room and each area was carefully, people had the time and to work out that everybody had to have adequate space. And these houses, I wouldn't say they're spacious, but they have adequate size. They've got a garden, and they had a situation where when you went into your garden, it looked like a big field at the back of your house, so you weren't overlooked. So you go out into your garden, and there'll be other people's gardens. It left it as a nice airy area. And where I used to live, you'd look out, and it was the houses the other side of this big area looked miles away, and it was like living in the countryside. And then in the 1970s, they completely ignored the Parker Morris standards, threw them away, didn't worry about the code of practice. And for example, where I live now, drives should be 3 meters wide. They're 2.5 meters wide, and they just cut everything down to the minimal. But people say, oh, code of practice. Oh, yes, they didn't work to it. No, it's just a code. There's no laws behind it. It's how it's good workmanship. That's really what it's about. And what it is now, it's maximum profit to cram as many people as they can and into it. But I wonder if anybody else has noticed this. If you look at a lot of these modern estates, they have one road in, and it's the same road that goes out. Okay, just one road. And there's a place near I live called Canada Fields. And when you look at this Canada Fields from a distance, all you would need would be a little bit of barbed wire around it, a checkpoint with the main road that goes in. They could have searchlights on top of the buildings. And I would say that in half a day, they could turn that place into a prison camp.
Well, we talked about this a lot, Chris. I mean, that's what they're doing there. The reason for closing a lot of the roads off and containing people in these very small areas is exactly that, because all you have to do is look at it on a map and you can see what they've done strategically. In other words, you could probably close off an area of 150,000 people with about 3 police cars. That's the idea behind it all. And I think this stuff was mapped a long time ago, and I don't think it's just Google, because I remember when there was surveys being done with helicopters. I don't know whether you remember this. It was about 15 years ago. Maybe it was a bit less. But you'd get helicopters going over at 3 o'clock in the morning, and everyone in London had them. And they were doing some kind of mapping, because somebody told me that that's what was going on. I've no idea whether that was what's going on, but I think there is a new grid being put into place, and we have things like fusion centres here, but they're not called fusion centres. You see a reference to it, but they're actually in different buildings. And so all the stuff that we've talked about comes into it. But again, it's about the quality of building is not there. So it's a very odd thing. And what I think, I'm going to put something to you now, we might have a break in a minute, but I think what they're doing, I think this is phase one. I think they're putting up these crappy places that aren't going to last, and the people are never going to own them properly. And the idea is that this is phase one. So they're all going to come down within about 5 to 10 years. And then it's going to be a much higher standard of residence. I think what they're trying to do is create these areas so that they're going to become the areas for the elites. And they're going to have these areas just outside it for everybody else. I think that's what these areas are being turned into, these certain areas in London that are rapidly escalating with this stuff. They're getting a lot of people in, but ultimately, I think what's going to happen is that they will make them absolutely elite areas. And you can already see that happening in some of these boroughs. That's why there's more crime, because you're getting an us and them mentality. And this has come in within just a few years. And even though it's not an overt thing, you can see that it's happening. And if you look at the amount of crime that's been happening, that's been reported this year, a lot of this is copycat crime, I think, but nothing happens by accident. And that Dr. Richard Day was saying that in 1969 in this lecture, it's on our website, it's called Social Engineers Then and Now. He was saying that basically that would be more surveillance and the place would be more of a police state, but ironically and conversely, really, there'd be more crime. And he said, but the two will work hand in hand. And you have to start looking at it like this. And once you start taking that view, it does start seem to make sense. Otherwise, what most people would see would just be corporate greed, which is there as well. But there's a much bigger picture to this, which we go into a lot. But having looked at all this stuff about habitat and how we're going to live, nowhere in there does it say anything about the practices of building, which is obviously for the developers, but that should be part of the agenda. The agenda should be about building standards too. If they're going to say, well, you're entitled to this, and to whether you're living in formal or informal settlements, you have a decent, dignified and rewarding life. You know, what does that mean? That could mean anything. You could say that, well, okay, you know, you're basically a slave, you're a wage slave, you're never going to pay for this, but you can have a decent, dignified and rewarding life. That's the point of all this. None of it is defined.
Yes, I call it Goldilocks syndrome. You know, I'd like to sort of touch briefly, if I may, Mark, on a project I worked on. I mean, my particular forte was industrial and commercial, and I admit I didn't do much housing because, really, between you and I, wasn't much money in it. And as a freelance guy, you know, you go where the money is. And I worked on this housing project in Hertfordshire, and I mentioned this briefly last week, where they knocked down 15 houses and put up 80 dwellings in their place. And people don't realise that we are actually graded. Now, I can't remember. I'm racking my brains here. Again, this is off the cuff. I think it was graded A's, B's and C's and D's. Again, your listeners may be able to help. But if you were an A, you lived in a higher class area, and I think it was a C, was a blue-collar worker, and so on and so forth. And this particular estate I was working on, there was maisonettes for single mothers, single parents. There was a wiggly-woggly road, which was just wide enough for a refuse truck to get up with difficulty. And so as you get the narrow road, you then had some rather modest housing, which I think might have been for the private sector, with garages. And they had a communal parking place round the back, and they had an old people's home. Now, first of all, looking at the old people's home, they decided to have these lovely panoramic windows, which the elderly folk could look out upon, to look at a brick wall and what should have been grass, but looked like a World War I battlefield, and rotary clotheslines and a sandpit. And the way of thinking was that the elderly people would tell the young mothers when it's raining so they can go and collect their washing, and it would all be a lovely, happy community. And I said, well, no, the sandpit will be a dog toilet, which it turned out to be. And there's a young mother, when they're looking after their young baby, going to go down a couple of flights of stairs to a communal area where she hangs out her knickers, where the old folk can look at her knickers flying in the wind. No. So these poor old people, they're near the end of their life and they're looking out on something that looks like Colditz. And if you went there today, you'd see washing hanging out over the balconies. The communal car parking area, that is a dumping place for old sofas and things like that. And then I said, well, look, hang on a minute. You've got a narrow road. When it's pouring with rain, what's someone going to do? Go around the communal parking area and bring their shopping from the communal parking area to their home? No, they're not. They're going to park opposite. Some poor chaps drive opposite. And they said, oh, yes, but, you know, they won't keep it there. I said, yes, they will. I said, no, it's a community. I said, they think for themselves. They're not going to go and park their brand new whatever it is in a communal parking area and come back and find that the wheel's missing. No, they're going to park outside their house and think they've got a right to park outside their house. And they're going to clog half the road up. And it's going to cause aggravation. Why don't we widen the road so there's plenty of room for them to do that? Oh, no, don't be silly. And that's Goldilocks syndrome. They think everybody's living in this happy utopia and, oh, I'm sure they'll be able to discuss it between their neighbours. No, they won't. They'll say, oh, I'm parking here and I don't give a damn if he can't get in his drive. That's his problem. That's the way they think. And I was told, you know, when I was, I put some lead flashing. I designed some lead flashing around the side of the building. I said, what's that? I said, a bit of lead flashing. These people, he said, are the next step up from scum. Plastic flashing, you don't want lead on there. Save some money. And everything was cut down to the basics. And there was concrete as an area where there was a kind of, where you drive under a house. You know, have you seen these ideas where you go to a communal parking area and you drive underneath part of a house? It's a bit difficult to explain. Yes. And that area was all concrete. I said, that's going to be full of graffiti. If you went there today, that's what you'd see. And it was actually in the local newspapers about 10 years afterwards. My sister lives nearby, and she said, look at this, you know, and it just said this particular area has a very high crime rate, and as you know, the mental illness is people seeing psychiatrists because it's driving them mad. Why? Because they're not thinking how people live, they're thinking in the utopia of this lovely community which is out of cloud cuckoo land. I mean, and you can see this in what, if you look at the material that the developers send to you, you notice that signs outside modern building developments, another exciting development. What's exciting?
Well, it's incredible, Chris, because what they keep doing is, I spent quite a lot of time in Camden, there's loads of them going up. And now, that area down by the canal is what is going to be an elite area. It's absolutely going the way of gated areas. They're going to cut off most of the canal down there, and everyone's going to have a key to get in. And you've got these few places that are going to be there, and other than that, the tourists will just come down. It's radically changed, and what you've got is these areas where everything is the same. So it's the homogenization that I find really creepy about it. But yes, they keep thinking of these different names to put on the sides of these boxes, and you just think it's a box, right? And it's register your interest now, and you think, well, why would you even be interested? You know, I mean, I suppose you've got to have somewhere to live, but you wouldn't register your interest, would you? You just go, how much are they? I've got to live around here. Oh, 500 grand. Oh, God. That's what you're going to say. And they're all the same. But there's slight differences. But basically, this new urban agenda that they're talking about, it doesn't sound anything like the way they present it. And it doesn't seem to have anything behind it, because I've read all of these documents, these sustainable development documents, right? And you've got like human settlements are linked so closely to existence itself. Well, of course they are. You've got got to have somewhere to live, haven't you? I mean, what a stupid thing to say. Human settlements are linked so closely to existence itself, representing such a concrete and widespread reality. Oh, they've mentioned concrete, Chris, so that's a start. That there's something actual practical going on here. So laden with questions of rights and desires, with needs and aspirations, so racked with injustices and deficiencies that the subject cannot be approached with the leisurely detachment of the solitary theoretician, which is exactly how they approach it.
Yeah, I call it amnesia architecture. That's what I think. That should be the standard term, amnesia architecture. But I mean, the Victorians, they made the same mistake. They went through it. What we learn from history is we don't learn from history. You look at a lot of these estates that went up in the Victorian times. They were awful, terrible, all the same. But I mean, going through another one is vibrant, sustainable communities. What's that?
Yeah. Well, the whole idea, what it is, it's all newspeak, and we report on this a lot, but it's good to get your input into this as an architect, because I talked to a few people in architecture about it, and none of them take any notice of these sustainable development things and this waffle, because I don't think anyone reads it. I mean, I read it because it's Orwellian crossed with Brave New World, crossed with this kind of utopia stroke dystopia thing, which is all sci-fi and doesn't mean anything. It's like when the plans for this work were happening in northeast London. Basically, it looks like something out of a sort of Ladybird book or something, and that's how they draw it. They draw it out like it's like one of these kids' books, and it doesn't even look real. So you've got this road layout that looks like a toy town, and when they build it, it is a toy town. And we talk about this stuff all the time, but it's I suppose the question I'm going to ask you next, Chris, is how could this have happened so quickly? Because it's happened within 5 years, really, hasn't it? The whole of London's been re-engineered, and where you are in the so-called satellite places that commuters live in. It's incredible to me that could have happened. Now, I know about the Localism Act, and they've changed the regulations, and we've had the Brownfield Summit and all the rest of it. We've covered this stuff in great detail. But it still astonishes me how quickly it's happening. So really, what is going to be the outcome? Because it looks temporary. So it's obviously phase one of something. In your opinion, what do you think it's phase one of, or where do you think it's going?
I think where it's going is, if you look at the other communists, like, for instance, Ceausescu, he did the same. And what he was doing is moving everybody out of the country into high-rise blocks.
Yeah.
And that is the sort of communist system where you have the countryside only for the elite, and then you have the depopulation agenda. And something will depopulate, because it's 100% certain they're not going to keep these houses. I mean, they'll fall down, I should think, in about 50 years' time. And what they're doing, they're turning people into slaves, first of all, working and working and working hard for what is basically something that's out of the Stone Age, where really a house should only be about the price of a new car, if that. And how can they charge you thousands of pounds for a house? I mean, when you buy something, you're paying for the labour charge. So, for example, if you bought, a modern computer, there's a lot of design that's gone into it. They are the overheads. But once those overheads have been paid for and the mass production kicks in, the price of the computers drop and drop and drop and drop. Cars, the price drops and drops. But how can they justify charging so many £1,000 for a house that was built in the Victorian times or the Edwardian times? It doesn't make sense. It's just making money out of old rope. And I really do believe they're going to make these kind of rabbit hutch type cities. They'll expand on London, and it'll just be like the film Metropolis, where you have the elite at the top and the poor at the bottom, working to keep the elite at the top where they are. And when the poor have had enough working time, and when they get a bit worn out, they're just sort of killed off. And I really do believe that. I think
that's where it's going. Yeah,
want.
I mean, it definitely is, and you can see that in the way that things aren't factored in. Well, they aren't factoring in things like doctors' surgeries because obviously there aren't going to be any. There aren't going to be any doctors that you can go and see. You might be able to talk to one on the phone and pay them to sit there listening to you. But yeah, all of this stuff hasn't been factored in. And I know people who are just getting out. But that's the weird thing. So people are deserting London, but they're building more houses, are building more flats. Outside London, they are building houses. In London, they're mainly building it's all these tiny flats. But
this started in the 60s, though. I mean, I think it started before. Sorry to chime in on the remark, but
yeah,
I was brought up on a council estate, and it was idyllic. It was built in the 1920s, this estate. And in the 1960s, they started to move the slum clearance out of London. And on this estate, it was mainly old World War I veterans, and people kept their houses absolutely spotless. And it had a very country feel about it. They're like little country cottages. It's actually North Tottenham. I don't know if you know it.
Yes, I do. I know that area exactly where you mean. And it is
near Risley Avenue School.
Yes, I know somebody who lives there. Yes.
Right, Marshall Road. Now, that place, it was idyllic when I was a nipper. And everybody knew everybody else. And you daren't be a naughty kid because somebody would see you and boom, you'd be up to your dad or your mum. You done what wrong? Take that. So kids behaved themselves. And then they started moving slum clearance. Now, I believe it's different now, but what happened is we had neighbours from hell move next to us, and their kids broke into an elderly person's garden and completely smashed it up. And the response from the woman was, well, if you didn't have a garden there, my kids wouldn't want to smash it up, would they?
They started doing this in London a lot. There was some houses built around the back of where my flat was. And it was this was years ago. It's a housing partnership called East Thames. And basically what they seem to have done is taken people who they wanted to get rid of in one part of London. And it was part of the deal that they did with these housing associations that the borough would take some of the ones they didn't want. And that actually happened, and all hell broke loose. And yes, I think now though, it's kind of weird because everything's changed. So what they're doing is they're getting rid of all those people out of London, and this was something I wanted to bring up as well. In that, I've just been looking at newspaper articles this week that have been sent to me that there are loads of people being pushed out of the area in northeast London. They are one of the worst boroughs for it. About 55% of people who are homeless are kicked out of the borough. They just disappear out of it. So this is an interesting development because it ties in exactly with what we're talking about. So what we're going to have is it's going to be a ruthless kind of atmosphere, and it's all going to be people crammed together. And ultimately, they're going to turn on anybody who is littering the place up. Or who doesn't go along with this new kind of uniformity, because that's what they're introducing, a uniformity. And they're now even telling shopkeepers what they've got to have in the shops, and they're going to train them how to deal with the public. Can you imagine this? This is business people. Can you imagine how patronizing that is? And so this is the state. This is actually happened so quickly. And of course, all this architectural stuff is a big part of it. Maybe we should have a break for a couple of minutes, Tony. Is that all right?
Yeah, it's fine, Mark. We're ready to go. Well done, gentlemen.
Yeah.
We've got two tunes. This is Windows himself.
Yeah.
Flashing lights in the sky, is it those aliens? The universe, multiverse, other dimensions. Monday night, Junction 5 of the M25. A UFO hovered low, and I was taken inside. It brains. I was telepathically entranced. They took my clothes, counted my toes, and flew into the sky. I could see the moon, Uranus too, and off to Nibiru. The aliens were small and grey, with big bug eyes. They scanned my mind for intelligent life, and they were quite surprised, 'cause I was really quite advanced. For an earthling in a trance. God blimey, it's like my fortune in here, airless. I hope you're not abducting me for medical experiments. Here, pull that down, you don't know where it's been. I was really quite advanced. For an earthling in a trance. On Tuesday night, I materialised back at Junction 5. Opens the door of my car, and I got inside. To my surprise, I was 3 feet tall, with big bug eyes. My feet won't reach the pedals now, and I'm still at Junction 5. But I'm technologically advanced, and I need to buy some shorter pants. I do, you know. Oh, blimey, you're out of this world, you are. I'm gonna miss you.
Float in my magical dam. Don't mess with the dark side. Stay clear from the dark side of town. Don't mess with the dark side. Stay clear with that fooling around. Oh baby, don't slip around with me. Can. Don't mess with the dark side. Stay clear from the dark side of town. Don't mess with the dark side. Stay clear from that fooling around. Whoa, baby, don't slip around. can. Don't mess with the dark side. Stay clear from the dark side of town. Don't mess with the dark side. Stay clear from that fooling around. Whoa, baby, don't slip around with me.
Welcome back to Windows on the World. I'm talking to Chris, and he's been on the show quite a few times before. Chris is an architect, and we were talking today about building and architecture, and I realised that it'd been totally left out of the sustainable development plans for urbanisation. And the only time I'd actually heard about any building and the intricacies of actually putting a building up, or what that now entails as far as planning goes, was when I went to an open meeting in Croydon with some property developers there. And they were just a small property development company. And they gave us the background of the land that they were going to build on, which was old railway land and all the rest of it. And they loosely adhered to these plans that were coming out of the UN, these sustainable development plans, which are being implemented everywhere. And the results of that are all around us, and this high density housing and how it's happened so quickly in the last few years and with no planning whatsoever, as far as we can tell, because obviously the Localism Act and there's been several, the Housing and Planning Act, the regulations have been totally relaxed in favour of councils basically being able to give them away to developers. And in an actual fact, they have to do that because the land has to become available if it's not being used. But I was just looking at the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. This is house building, new builds and dwellings in England. This is just for England, it says. This was the December quarter of 2017 last year. It says, on a quarterly basis, new build dwelling starts in England. That means the buildings being put up, places to dwell, dwellings, were estimated at 41,280 in the latest quarter. That's in the quarter, a 5% increase compared to the previous 3 months and a 1% decrease on a year earlier. Completions were estimated at 42,860 in the quarter, 7% higher than the previous quarter. Okay. Now, annual new build dwelling starts were totaled at 162,180 in the year to December 2017, up 5% compared with the period December 2016. Private enterprise new build dwelling starts in the December quarter were up 8%. All starts are now 141% above the trough in the March quarter of 2009, 141%. So they keep telling us that there's a shortage of housing, and I really dispute this, because these new blocks that are going up, even though people are moving in, a lot of them are remaining empty. So they're being used as safety deposit boxes. And we're getting a sort of situation where London's a bit like Dubai or somewhere like that. And that's what I think phase 2 might be, because these places that are being put up are not really fit for purpose now. They're not really going to last very long. And then we're going to look at certain areas. Certain areas are going to be the places that are going to become really, really desirable, which aren't desirable at the moment. I think this phase 2 part is going to kick in, and there's going to be redevelopment again, and it's going to be very, very high end of the market, probably gated communities where people don't actually live, and people are going to be living more in these up and coming places where there's just going to be huge density of population. So I think there's going to be a load of re-engineering going on looking at it, because otherwise it doesn't make much sense to me. Have you got any thoughts on that, Chris?
Well, yes. Well, first of all, thanks for calling me architect, but actually I'm an architectural technician. It's a little bit different. It's a bit like a doctor and a chemist. You've got people always think that chemists are failed doctors. Well, I think that technicians are failed architects. No, we're not. What happens is the architect does generally does the overall design, and the technician makes sure everything goes together and does the sort of nuts and bolts and whatever, you know. And I was a freelance technician, and we were the sort of mercenaries or dung beetle of the profession. We were like, because we did the jobs that nobody else really wanted to do. And most of the time you went in when there's a crisis, but what happens that it was so high pressure that most are burnt out by the time you're about 50. You know, I almost had a nervous breakdown, to be straight with you. But what you was going back, you know, onto what you were saying, there's two things to look at. Number one is obviously the density. I've gone through this before. The first garden city that I know of is Letchworth, and it was £17 per hectare, and that was at about 1900. Now it went up to 49 to 50 homes per hectare, and they're talking about 100 homes per hectare. And I think you were saying, Mark, that it's even higher than that.
It was ridiculously high. Peter O'Kane, the housing officer from Hackney, when we went to the public debate where none of the real local councillors turned up in Leytonstone, and this development's been halted now, but he was saying that it was the sort of density that you'd expect above Victoria Station in one of these hives, but it was out in Leytonstone, and he couldn't understand it. So they're making this high density everywhere. The high density is all about what this urban agenda is really going towards. It's packing people into cities, and it doesn't seem to have been thought out at all, because it's already starting to go wrong. But the other side of it is that the control grid is already there, and when they bring in this 5G, and we talked about this. I mean, if you put anybody who listens to our shows can put this bigger picture together now. But yes, going back to these garden cities, it was quite interesting because I looked at these videos from someone called the Academy of Urbanism, and it was talks of on the New Society. And this fellow, Robert Fishman, he kept going about social justice. It was like every second, well, social justice means no justice. Social justice means that, like the UN Human Rights Act, you know, basically that means that you have a right to justice as a person before the law. Well, a person doesn't have any rights. A person is a thing. So we don't need to get into all that. But basically, anything that is called a community has rights. So some stones at the side of a road have rights. This is how it's defined. And what I found quite interesting about watching these guys from the 60s was that apart from using this kind of similar language actually to the Sustainable Development Goals and all the rest of it, there was the ideas behind these garden cities. And Milton Keynes was an example, along with Hampstead Garden Suburb. I'll get to Milton Keynes in a minute, but it was Raymond Unwin and Barry Parker were the architects of Letchworth Garden City, and they basically designed all that coming out of Hampstead Garden Suburb. And the growth in land values, it says, was not just for speculation, but was to get back land into mixed use. And he said the problem came with the car. Now, the Regional Planning Association got to grips with the car in America, and Milton Keynes is a result in the UK of this attempt. And vast grid cities were to be adapted to vehicles. Cul-de-sacs were to keep the streets quiet, which is an incredibly good idea when you think about it. Cul-de-sacs are great, but they don't, because of the urbanization agenda, they're not factored in anymore. You don't get cul-de-sacs. What you get is high density housing in really busy places. This is what London's become. So these places with cul-de-sacs, that it's now like going back to the 1950s if you see a cul-de-sac. What do you think on that, Chris? Because that's an interesting one.
Well, yes, but there's two ways of looking at it. What they're doing is what they did in the 60s is they cut off a lot. They made a lot of cul-de-sacs. I can see, yes, they are good to stop through traffic, but when they cut off the rat runs, if there's one problem on the main road, the whole thing becomes gridlock. And,
well, that's what happens now.
Yeah. and it's very similar to, we're going back to this 20-mile-an-hour zones. Near where I live, there's the old A10, the new A10, and they're the Great North Road, I believe. No, sorry, that's the A1, isn't it? No, but anyway, it goes from London up to Cambridge, I believe. Now, the new A10 is a dual carriageway, and you've got the old A10, which is, shops and housing either side. Now, if anything goes wrong on the new A10, people go on the old A10, and it doesn't really cause much of a problem. When that's made as a 20-mile-an-hour zone, it'll be total gridlock. But that, I think, is what they want, is total gridlock.
Well, this is the plan, because somebody was talking about this an Agenda 21 talk a couple of years ago. He said, what you're going to have is you're going to have your little area where you've got your gym, your little supermarket and your coffee shop, and outside that is going to be traffic chaos. That's what they planned for, and that was the plans for Agenda 21. It's basically so it becomes impossible to use a car, and you've got the whole of the population who don't have a car screaming at you because you've got one. It's very, very simple. Divide and rule. That's how they're going to do it, and it is a plan, and it's very difficult to actually get that over to the public, because they wouldn't do that. Well, we know they would, because the social engineering is a science. It is a science. Now, this is interesting. Traffic leads to fall in bus passenger numbers, right? So this is Agenda 21 gone wrong. What they've done, there's a picture here of absolute traffic chaos. Loads of buses in a row. Looks like the top part of Hoe Street in Walthamstow, which used to run freely. Even in peak hours, it ran freely. Now it's a traffic jam for the whole of Hoe Street, from what's called Lea Bridge Road down to Forest Road, which basically cuts right through the heart of the area. So it says here that buses are now being reduced and people are stopping using buses. Now that is incredible, because it says Transport for London figures show buses along one of Waltham Forest's busiest roads where the Mini Holland was built. It wasn't built. No, that's absolute rubbish. Mini Holland wasn't built. They just closed roads. That's not building anything. They made pavements wider and they pedestrianised the road, one of the roads there. That's all they did. The rest of it was just done with barriers. So they didn't build it. So that's complete rubbish as well. Oh, is it from this? Oh, it's from the East London and West Essex Guardian, the ones who can't spell and don't have stories in. Yeah. Well, they don't have actually stories that make sense in. 9 bus routes serve Waltham Forest principal bus corridor between Walthamstow Central and Leighton Baker's Arms. Right. It says in April 2014, that was just before this Mini Holland thing, these routes accounted for 47.1 million passenger journeys. The campaign said that between 2014 and 17, changes to road layouts are part of the Mini Holland cycling scheme have caused more traffic. Well, of course they have. Buses caught in traffic have seen passenger numbers drop sharply to 41.8 million. That's 7 million down. Okay, right. That equates to a drop of 5.3 million journeys. Yeah. Paul Dogan, a Save Our Buses campaigner, said scenes of buses locked into continuous lines of traffic on Hoe Street between central Walthamstow and the Baker's Arms would have been unimaginable 3 years ago. Exactly. Congestion systematically damages local services, leading to longer journey times, reliability suffers, and passengers are less able to depend on the buses. Okay, so it says 5 Waltham Forest bus services, including 2 on Hoe Street, have been cut in recent months due to falling passenger demand. So there you go. You've got cars up and that are blocking it all day long, lines of buses that nobody can get on. That's Mini Holland for you. Well done, Mini Holland. Isn't that wonderful? It's just like Amsterdam, isn't it? Not. Okay, so there you go, Chris. Now, this Milton Keynes idea was quite interesting, but what it's turned into is indicative of where things have gone, which they didn't plan for. In the 60s, in 1967, there was a 60,000 population. Now it's 270,000. They reckon to be 310,000 by 2028 and 400,000 by 2050. Now, they do these really big increases in population to frighten people. It says 60% of households have no children. So how are they going to have 400,000 by 2050? Doesn't make sense, because those are quite big properties there. You know, most of Milton Keynes still has is mainly houses. But it says the life expectancy is now lower. over the past 35 years, it had the fastest growing economy in the UK. There was 21,000 jobs in 1967. Remember, there was 60,000 people there, so people commuted. And now there's 165,000 jobs in the borough. It says here, more people commute in than out, which is very interesting. 1 in 4 see themselves as black, minority or ethnic, and 2 out of 5, which is 40% of mothers, were not born in the UK. Fred Pooley, the planner of Buckinghamshire Council, who proposed the new city, which was the Milton Keynes. It was built around a monorail, which was really interesting, a figure-of-8 monorail, and it would be free but paid for by the rates. And that would have been true mobility for all, he says. The idea was rejected by government, and it was all. It also needed a road network. It was called Pooleyville, Mobility for All, but he couldn't devise a mobile. Oh yes, he said they can't devise mobility for the city, but they can put a man on the moon. That was one of the last things he said. So now under half the population have access to a car. So again, what we're saying is that there's much less people driving, but what they're doing is they're pushing all the traffic onto a couple of main roads to make it absolutely impossible to have a car. But the history of Milton Keynes is quite interesting, and the changes that have gone on there even more interesting. So the idea behind it all was that it was basically a big land grab, but now we see land grabs are much easier. Land grabs then were probably not as easy as now, and that's, in my opinion, why things have gone the way they are doing, because we've got all these new developments coming up everywhere, and there's no real planning going on any of it. None of it fits in. Any thoughts on that, Chris?
Yes. The little clue might be the amount of money that councils are making, because governments are cutting back funding to local councils. And what people don't realise is that, obviously, without every planning submission, the council generates about £17,420. Under Section 106, a developer has to pay £3,000 per additional bedroom. Then, of course, upon completion of a house, every household has to pay, on average, plus or minus, about £2,000 per annum council tax. And then what people don't realise is that a previous chancellor emptied the pension pots. So that's the reason the council tax, contract has gone up, because we're paying for the local council's workers' pension, because their pension pot has been emptied. So it's in the council's interests to have lots more housing, because they're going to get much more revenue. They're going to get more money coming in. And of course, admittedly, you've got an increased population, there'll be higher overheads, but, and this is what I've written here, but along with that, there would be profitable opportunities for areas of council services that have been privatised. Hence the reason council tax has more than doubled since 1997. I can prove that, in order to finance the profits of nominated contractors.
Yeah, well,
So
someone
it's
just
all
posted
to
the
do-
Infrastructure Act 2015 in here, which we have covered. We did a lot of stuff with this, with Architects for Social Housing, which is just a group of people who basically protest against what's going on. But we went into all these acts, and Lord Adonis and all these people, and Khan was into it. Khan signed off to Savills. I mean, Savills are writing policy for local government. This is insane, and what can possibly go wrong? And they just say, well, London has got high land values and we're going to exploit it, and that's all they're doing. It's just they've brought in the worst possible people to manage everything. And your thing about the councils is absolutely true. Yeah, we're paying for their pensions. Why are we paying for their pensions? That's the point. That this, to me, is the whole key to it. These large bureaucracies, we need to try and get away from them. They're increasing in size. That's the problem. Tony, have you got anything that you wanted to put over from the chat box?
There are a few comments from the chat. Yep. Hold on just a second while I locate me. Where's that gone? Right, it was there a second ago, but it's gone. Right, ban everything from the roads. They'll be safe then. This is obviously from the first part of the show, talking about congestion, etc. That was Stu. Gremlin says, look, people, paying makes London work. Yep, well, apparently it makes it work for some anyway. Didn't make it work for me. Most local papers are Newsquest, I think. Don't know about that. You might.
Yeah, NewsQuest is a big group. There's another group as well. They're basically conglomerates, and they run everything, and they are really propaganda rags. But I was astonished at the poor grammar and the non-stories. The stories are self-contradictory that they were putting in. Those ones that we were reading out earlier on from that newspaper, and you just think, well, I've looked at this other thing as well, the Waltham Forest Echo, and there's an interview with this Claire Coghill, and it's blatant that she's actually just giving sound bites from property developers, and the person interviewed he asks the question and lets her get away with it. I mean, this is the thing, that none of these people are brought to account. Nobody will call them to account, and we proved last week how easy it is to do.
Mm-hmm.
It can be done.
It can.
You know.
So take courage and encouragement from what has been achieved. Kremlin says, packed in like rats. Rats eat their young when they are forced together. This has been known for over 50 years. So, yeah, that's an interesting point. I think it's also been known that humans can pretty quickly turn to eating each other when they run out of food, but that might be a different story. Plastering has changed. No love and plaster anymore. Yeah, many aspects of plastering have changed over the years. It's not anywhere like what it used to be. And there's a couple of points come up later about chemicals in modern housing, how they're going to break down and cause environmental chaos as well in the future. I've got no reason to disbelieve that either. Have you noticed that car parks today, the new ones, they have shaved inches off? I swear it. I don't. So maybe it's what smaller spaces are you saying there, Kremlin? I'm not sure. Okay, and when we go talking about housing, the comment from me really, it's the throwaway society, built-in obsolescence. I mean, it had to come for housing, didn't it? So it's here now.
It absolutely is. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. Where are we going? There's a question here on a completely different subject that you may or might not want to go into tonight, but I'll ask it anyway because it's next up. What's Mark's opinion on the little march today in London with Tommy Robinson and the Pied Pipers of Hamlet? Or Hamlets?
Well, it's the divide and rule strategy, isn't it? I mean, it's pretty boring, really. In fact, the thing is that I actually tweet to these people quite a lot, because when I get really too tired to do anything else, I put things on Twitter for a bit of a laugh. And I'm always including Katie Hopkins and saying, well, why don't you cover what's going on in Palestine? You care so much about people. And the point is that they're all funded by the same source, this so-called alt-right. It's just another trap. Yeah. And it's not really even about freedom of speech. It's about a third party stirring up hatred between Muslims and Christians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Katie Hopkins and co. and Pat Condell and Tommy Robinson stood on an Israeli tank in his IDF shirt. You know, I mean, it's ridiculous, really. And all this alt media stuff, to me, is that rebel media, you know.
Yeah, I think there's the real issue about it in the chat has been tonight that no one's actually covering it. There's no word of it anywhere from the mainstream on what's gone on today. So whatever your opinion on what they're marching for or who they are, there should be some news on what has happened there. I would have thought you would have expected that, wouldn't you?
Yes, I expect there'll be people down there. There's a load of the football supporters lot going down, I think, and it'll just be them arguing with Muslims, I should think. Well, basically, you've got your agent provocateurs arguing with Muslims and Muslims arguing back. You know, I mean, it's kind of pointless, really, and it's addressed the issue. Yeah. However, it looks like it's time, doesn't it, Tony? It's actually flown over tonight.
It does. You've done a brilliant job there, gentlemen. Well done. Most enjoyable. And thanks to everyone for listening. I don't know whether anyone else got anything to add before we jog along quickly.
Well, just thanks, Tony and Mark. Fantastic. Thank you.
Cheers, Chris.
Yeah, I thought it was good to actually cover that, because getting it from a point of view of someone who's actually involved in building and planning buildings and the execution of putting buildings up, because it seems to be missing from the whole equation of the strategy of urban development, you know, and what we talk about week in, week out. So I thought I'd go get some inside information there, and it's been quite enjoyable.
Well done. Cheers, everyone. We'll see you next week.
Next week.
Bye-bye.
Reversal of the